who is, I'm sure, known to almost everyone of you. Father Bob has been such an immense figure within the province and within the Dominican family over the years, interrupted by his brief sojourn as Procurator General in Rome for 6 years, and along with that, until his retirement, his many years working half the year in the Angelicum, teaching for decades and decades to come. Was he? I mean, I remember saying once that someone has spent his lifetime doing X, and his comment was, "Well, it seems like my life has come to an end." So we actually, Bob is just in the middle of this flow of both teaching canon law, and one of the great canon laws of the country and of the order, and also moral theology. So it's a delight to have you, Bob, this evening, and to start off our seminar talking to us about the virtues in general.
Thank you. Better you clap now, you won't when I finish. Is this working? It is working. Now you should have a sheet, I hope, from me with two sides. And it's to be read from left to right. And I'll read it briefly, so I hope you're aware, which sums up Summa Theologiae from 55 to 70. So it's read from left to right. So this is Aquinas then. We have the good habits or virtues, and then the bad habits, sins or vices. So we're doing the good habits, the virtues. That divides into two: virtues in themselves, matters connected with the virtues. And matters connected with the virtues are the gifts of the Holy Spirit, the beatitudes, the fruits of the Holy Spirit. We're not doing that. So we're back to virtues in themselves, and that divides up. So there's a lot of divisions going on. That divides up into 5. The essence of virtue, its subject, its division, its cause, and certain properties. So then you move into the right again, and you'll see, perhaps it's easiest if you look at the numbers on the right, which is like an index, it's for questions. You've got 61, the cardinal virtues, and that's what Sister Magdalene will be doing tomorrow. And then 62, you've got the theological virtues, which is what Catherine will be doing. So that leaves me with a rest, or the need of a rest. So that's the. Now, as Martin has hinted in what started to sound like an obituary, but reports of my death were exaggerated. Don't believe them. It's wishful thinking. Having been as a friar, Dominican, 50 years, 52, there are two ways of doing Aquinas, because it's an ocean. It's over 7 million words. More or less, I stopped counting and I fell asleep. It gives you an idea of the kind of numbers. And this is just a Summa, which is 5 volumes, either in English or Latin. Now, there are two ways of doing this over the years I've discovered. You either, as it were, think of the whole of Aquinas on a subject and narrow it down to a nutshell, which I'm not going to do. Or you do it the other way. You start in the middle and you radiate out. Because Thomas is like a web. You can't touch anything without touching everything else. So I'm going for in fact, on all this immense sheet and schema, what I'm going to offer is the essence of virtue, question 55. That's about it. So I'm going to work from there outwards to varying degrees. So that's the method, and we'll see if it works. Plenty of time for discussion. This may surprise you what's to come, because it might not sound very Christian. which is strange, you might expect a talk on the virtues to be about the imitation of Christ. That if we behave like Christ and give examples, well, you'll find hardly anything about Christ. Most of it's from Aristotle, the philosopher, as Aquinas called him. Now this may surprise you, and I think there'll be a number of surprises I hope tonight. Like I finish my talk, I mean, the first surprise. So a lot of philosophy, which is interesting. So what I plan to do then is to take what you've got on the other side of this, basically one question, we'll get to it, I'll go through it with you, and then radiate outwards. The second part of my talk will be, why has virtue ethics become so important nowadays? And what are the advantages for us Catholics to have a virtue ethic as opposed to the alternatives? So that's what I'm offering. The story goes, it's attributed to various friars, usually Brian Davis, sitting on a bus with two women in front of him talking, and he couldn't help overhearing. And one was telling all her troubles, and at one point the other one said, "Be philosophical about it." And the first one said, "How do you mean?" "Well, just don't think about it." If I'd known that 50 years ago, I'd been a philosopher. But alas, you get my amateurish theological impressions. So the first surprise then is that Aquinas, on the face of it, and we'll come back to this obviously, doesn't seem to be doing very Christian, a Christ-centered piece of work on the virtues. But for him, he only called one person the philosopher, and that's Aristotle, who of course wasn't a Christian. That will turn out to have advantages, but there's also a warning, as it were. If you were expecting a talk, as it were, on the imitation of Christ, then this isn't the one, and Aquinas won't be the one. So from Aristotle, as you see here, at the top it says habits in particular, and that's not a reference to the sisters of Christ. And he takes that from Aristotle. He translates habitus from the Greek hexis. But already then, we begin this journey through language, that a habit, as we understand, is more or less the opposite of a virtue. And, so I'd better illustrate that first. As we modern people say, a habit is kind of like a routine. You know, before you go to bed, you've got the habit of doing this. Every time you go there, you've got the habit of doing that. Or you have a smoking habit or whatever. Now, that won't do, in our sense, for translating habitus, because you almost no control over a habit. It's, in fact, almost where your free will stops, unlike virtue, which is precisely where your free will begins. And that's part of the essence of the virtues, that they're rational and they're work of a will, and they're very much our cooperation with God, both in the humanity He's given us and in the grace-filled life He's given us. But beware then of thinking of habitus immediately, oh, it's a habit. And that's why at the top it says habits in particular. It's best to think of virtues as predispositions, that you've become a certain kind of person who habitually acts like this. Now, you may do good things now and then, but that won't be a virtue. It would just be on 9 o'clock on Tuesday you did that good deed. But that may not necessarily be your virtue. So that's going to be another important, actually it's all distinctions in Thomas. Habits then are kind of not to be confused also with conditions. And Aquinas usually gives health or beauty. He says they might be transitory. So they're not virtues to be healthy or beautiful, because they might stop, whilst virtues are much more deeply rooted. And in fact we say, and character is going to be a key to all this, forming character. and I'm told now, even in training courses for employees and in schools, there's character buildings now coming into morals, which is more than just knowledge of different things, or even knowledge of good things. It's forming character, which then can act in different situations virtuously. And this is why we say of someone, oh, she must have acted out of character. It's totally out of character for her to do that. Or vice versa. Oh, well, what do you expect? I mean, it's exactly what he would do. It's his character. So this character then is going to be one of the key words, although Thomas doesn't use it as such. But I think it's a more modern way of understanding it. One of the things I've learned, so despite my blonde hair and blue eyes, I'm not the English gentleman you think. In fact, born in Italy, which gives you certain advantages and disadvantages. One of them is to talk about animals to a British audience. Now, I'll mention animals, but please let's not have a discussion about dolphins and whales can be trained to do that. And I say this because 2 days ago, speaking to another group in Oxford about friendship in Aquinas, I happened to mention that Aquinas says, you cannot be a friend to a horse. So sure enough, first question, well, I'm closer to my dog than I am to my mum. So take what point Thomas is trying to make. He's trying to say that animals act basically by instinct or training, but they can't undo very much either of the instincts or the training, unlike the virtuous person who can and who has to acquire it. Even when it's given, you have to exercise it, and it has a lot to say about that. Then he has a range of virtues, which you see on the sheet. Some he calls intellectual, which are primarily of the mind, and he lists wisdom, science, understanding of first principles. But then what he calls moral virtues, of which there are 4 main ones, Sister Magdalene will be doing tomorrow, the cardinal ones. They're called cardinal, not because cardinals have them, although they might, but because cardo's a hinge in Latin, so it's what the moral life swings on. And she'll explain how under those 4 headings, most moral virtues come under there, under those 4 hinges. But getting a bit nearer then, as always, of course, he has to take in Augustine. But here he corrects Augustine in a number of places. But that's to counterbalance Aristotle, I suppose. So from Augustine he got that virtue, what Augustine this is a good quality of the mind disposing us to live rightly. Now he changes quality to habit in his sense. So that's what a virtue is in a few words. It's a good habit of the mind disposing us, to disposition us to live rightly. So you've got all the elements there. At one point, almost as an aside, still on question 55, but not on your sheet yet, Augustine overdoes the God side of the equation and has a much more bleak view of a human than Aquinas did. So Augustine tends to, well, this sounds odd, but to give too much to God and too little to us. I'll explain that. So this is, again, Sister Magdalene tomorrow will say some words about infused virtues. You either acquire them, as you grow up, as you get on, you acquire virtues, or they're infused by God. And the theological ones, faith, hope, charity, are only as infused by God. But Augustine, says Thomas, overdoes it really, because he agrees with Augustine that God gives us those virtues without our action. They're given to us either by our natures or by grace. But, adds Thomas, but not without our consent. In this sense, the words of Augustine, which God works in us without us, are to be understood. As to those so that's what, even when God gives us something, it's not without our consent. And Our Lady of the Annunciation is a classic one. Again, I went to boarding school at an early age, run by sisters, not Dominicans, which explains my normal sort of stable personality. And we were brought up on we should be obedient, especially the Mother Superior, just like Our Lady was at the Annunciation. Well, alas, obviously, pre-Vatican II, southern Italy, they hadn't read much of the Annunciation because Our Lady asked 3 questions, far from saying yes. And the angel has to answer twice before she says yes. So this immediate unquestioning yes, I've no idea where this spirituality came from, but that's what we grew up on. And it's nothing to do with Luke's Gospel. Now Thomas, he's sort of straight left a Neapolitan. I mean, he went to school with Benedictines, not the sisters, but he then adds, as to those things done by us, God causes them in us. So he agrees with Augustine, it's all caused by God. Yet not without action on our part, since he, God, works in every will and every nature. And that's a Thomist breakthrough, really, in theology. I said it sounds paradoxical at first. I'll try and give you an analogy. But all modern thinking, the biggest modern thinkers who've had immense influence in the world, Marx, Freud, Nietzsche, they all agree that unless we kill God, we can't be free. It's crucial to these main thinkers, Marx, Freud, Nietzsche, that we kill God. Otherwise, we'll never be free. And that's because we've got the wrong model of us and God, obviously. They either think God's a rival to us on the same plane. So if it's him, it can't be us. If it's us, it can't be him. Or that we're basically puppets in the loving hands of God, but puppets. Puppet show. Invisibly maneuvered by him. And those are not caricatures, I think, of deep philosophical positions, and alas, for some Christians. So God's our rival, so we scratch our heads, because, well, if God's grace is from God, well, what do we have to do? You know, if the angel came to Our Lady, why didn't she say yes straight away? Because it's either or. Now, let me give you an analogy, which, like all analogies, only works up to a point. So I'm trying to show how we simultaneously can say it's all done by God, but with our consent and our action. Imagine a mother with a toddler, and they're sitting in their living room, and the toddler's doing what toddlers do, and exploring the world and discovering his humanity. He uses his senses, he touches, he looks, and he licks. He starts to say words, he starts to walk. Now the doorbell goes, and the mother goes to answer the doorbell, leaves the room. Now the toddler, far from being more free now the mother is in there, in fact falls apart, starts to cry and shout. Now everything the toddler did, walking, talking, touching, and so on, was his action, willed by him, done by him, but only with the presence of the mother. Take away the mother, the child isn't more free. In fact, what little freedom he had collapses. Now that's an analogy with us and God. It's not as if God's here in the room, we're less free. Like the toddler's not less free. If, as it were, God were to be killed, as Freud, Marx, Nietzsche encourage us to, then we wouldn't be more free. What we've salvaged from the fall in our humanity, even that would collapse. So that's an analogy, and to try and explain these few words of Aquinas, that if God does it, it's not without our consent. If we do something caused by us in God, he works on our part, since he works in every will and every nature. So it's important not to see us and God as rivals, or us as puppets in the hands of a loving God. I did friendship the other day in Aquinas for another group, and again it's Aristotle again, not much about Christ there, except I call you friends. And Aristotle said that between God and humans there can be no friendship. That's one of the bits obviously Aquinas had to deny. Except he says, well yes, in itself it's true, because there's no equality between us and God, and you can't have friends unless you're equal, in some sense. But he says, because of Jesus Christ, then we have something in common, someone in common. Now, as you'll be pleased to know, time moves on. I'd like to say something about what you've got on your sheet, a bit of question 55 from the Gilby Summa. And so we're, unless you find the Latin easier, we're on the right-hand side of the English. And again, forgive, this is a translation from the 60s, so when Aquinas puts homo, which does not mean male, it means person, vir, V-I-R, which is not unconnected to virtue, means male. But here is always translated as man, so forgive me. But as you see on the Latin on the left, it's homo, which is not male, it's a person. Right, so that's the advantage of having the Latin on the left. But I apologize, I'll keep reading. Man is so constituted that his body is like matter, his soul like form. As for the body, that indeed a man possesses in common with other animals, and likewise the powers common to animated body. First of all, that should have shocked you. Notice, Thomas doesn't say we're like animals, he says we are animals. Now this is the angelic doctor. And you see here, he doesn't say his body is like matter, his soul like form. As for the body, that indeed a man possesses in common with other animals. See, he doesn't say animals. This is the angelic doctor, the one who best explained angels, has never been surpassed, saying we are animals. Now again, that's thought to be an insult normally. If somebody's bestial, whilst somebody says you're angelic, that's meant to be a compliment. Well, either way, he's denying what God's done. I mean, he's not made you an animal, he's not made you an angel. He never will. So there are traps here in this pseudo spirituality, of which this will be another example. So Thomas is clear, your cat, your dog, a carrot in a field, they've all got souls. For him it means to be alive, that's what a soul is. So a carrot, a dog's got a soul. But it hasn't got an immortal soul. That's the difference. So we are animals, we're not like animals. But we're a peculiar kind of soul, an immortal one, unlike the carrot or the cat, but like the angels, so we're bridge beings. And this is vital to the virtues, because if they constitute us, if the virtues express us, if they dispose us to act in a certain way, well, we have to know what kind of thing we are. Now, the word good comes up a lot in Thomas, and it comes up with virtue. Again, that doesn't in itself mean moral. Oh, she's good, or he's good. It means having all you need to be what you are, whether it's a carrot, a flower, an angel, or us. That's what goodness is. I lived with Herbert Mackay for 17 years, which I think it's time off purgatory for me. If not and once Herbert gave an example, you can never better it. So this is Herbert. I acknowledge my debt to Herbert. But you've all sat down on chairs. Suppose you sat down and one of the legs came off the chair and you fell over. Now you might say, well, I don't know, I'm not sure what you might say. But you might say, you bad chair. Well, you might say to someone, look, that's not good. That chair's no good. It's a bad chair. Well, why? Well, because chairs are meant to support your weight. That's what a chair is. So when it doesn't, when it fails to be itself, it's not good, it's bad. But supposing, as Martin's finishing 8 years as provincial, as a little wheeze, he put an egg, a hen's egg, on one of the seats you were sitting on, and you sat on it. Now again, I won't say what you might say, but again, now there it would be stupid to say, this is a bad egg, I sat on it and it broke. Well, why? Well, because an egg is not meant to carry your weight, unlike a chair. So unless you know what something is, you can't say it's good or bad. Well, virtues are like that, you see. A virtue means you're acting as you should, as a human being, with the limitations of just being human, but it's a God-given nature, our humanity. But then, of course, it's taken higher to a level of friendship and grace, which nature can never give us, evolution can never give us, biology can never give us. So, continuing then on page 9 of the sheet of the English, those powers alone which are proper to soul, namely to rational powers, belong exclusively to man. Consequently, human virtue, of which we are now speaking, cannot belong to what is bodily. but only to what is proper to soul. Human virtue, therefore, does not imply a relation to being, but rather to activity. Essentially, then, it is an operative habit. Now, the operative bit is crucial. It's the difference between someone giving you a Christmas, a vase or something, and giving you a bicycle. I mean, a vase you put on your shelf or whatever, and you look at it and say, oh, lovely. A bicycle, I mean, it's no use just putting it in your shed. You're meant to exercise it and learn the skill that goes with a bicycle. So that's what he means by virtue being operative. This will come out, no doubt, in various ways as we speak this weekend. But you notice that it's quite clear. And then just look at his answer to the first objection, hence 1, still on page 9. The mode of action corresponds to the agent's condition, for as a thing is, so does it act. So this is then why we say, oh, she couldn't have done it. It would be out of character for her to do that. Or, oh, I'm sure he did it. I mean, it would be exactly in character for him to behave like that. You see? And that's only answerable on virtue ethics grounds. Just a few words on the rest of question 55, Article 1, which is not on your sheet. Just a few words. It perfects a power. Now, again, language is language. Every word carries a history. We don't always agree with the history. But so virtue is related to virile, which is related to vir, male. But for obvious historical reasons, when physical strength was more necessary when it. That's right.
So more
There's some seats over here, Simon.
Yeah.
No, don't blame you. So welcome to those from Scotland. Can't possibly repeat, but there is a sheet, a handout, which has got a total scheme of what this might involve, and at the back, just one fraction of a question from Aquinas on habits. But just a few comments on question 55, which is not on your sheets, but you can see it in the chart. So he says it's a certain perfection of a power, potentia. And as I said, the word for him would, in Latin, would be linked to strength. So, oh, he did that by virtue of his training in the gym. By virtue of his training in the gym. It doesn't mean he did something good. It means he did something to make him operative in that. So this is how virtue's got shades off into not just a disposition, not just of reason, but also operative and in the will. You do something about it. Then he says, again, this may surprise you, it's virtue which structures love. Now, the word he uses there is amor, not caritas, which is the Christian word, agape, and so on, but as it were, the standard human word for love. Now, for Thomas, it may come as a surprise to you, love is not a virtue. You think, what? I mean, nowadays you can't speak 5 minutes without I say, love, all we need is love, we've got to love. Yeah. Well, you see, it all depends what you love, how you love it, when you love it, why you love it. Then it might be a virtue. But as an attachment, it may not be virtuous. It may be part of your vice to have a wrong kind of love. But again, we've lost that. Our vocabulary is very limited as modern people in this context. And we'll see the range of virtues that are involved when we hear tomorrow about the 4 main moral ones and then, of course, theological ones. And so he says, love is set in order in us by virtue. Now, order, again, for Thomas, it's not law and order like we think, policeman hitting you on the head with a baton. It's not that picture. Order is one of the great words in Thomas, because Thomas almost never says yes or no to anything. It always says, it depends. In this sense is this, in that sense is that. So ordering, dividing, classifying, well, as you see from this sheet, classifying. You could do this of any page of the Summa, would come out with something like this. So he, of all people, order them, for him is a very valuable, important word. And our virtue orders our love, if it does. And if not, it's not love. It then might slip into sin or vice. Vice is the equivalent, the opposite, of virtue. It's not, we all sin on and off, but vice is when it's systematic, when it's, if you like, a habit, in a bad sense. So that's one point. The second is, again, virtue has a strong bearing on action, it's operative, and so it's essential to human virtue, as he says, that it be an operative habit. And then, of course, it's a work of reason, which is why, in one sense, you can never misuse a virtue. It just means you haven't got it, rather than misusing it. Also, he says that we can use the word metaphorically. So he says, we could say of X, he's a good thief. Now, we mean he's good at stealing. So that's a qualified. Doesn't mean the one next to Jesus on the cross. By a good thief, he means someone's good at burglary. He's Neapolitan, he knows about this. So I'm told by the press, which of course is biased. Yeah, but I would have, well, as you can see, I could have said more, but I want to touch on the second part of my talk. So I hope that's virtue in its essence, which then the other two speakers and the collective session, I see David Goodale's here for tomorrow, will tease out the whole range of these virtues, and there are dozens and dozens of them, which make us human, properly human, which already is an achievement, but then if infused, which only God can do, but remember, not without our consent. We're not puppets of a loving God, we're just not puppets. I always think of Herbert when I do morals. As he once said to me, Bob, that's not a bad argument, it's just not an argument. He was a tough love school of teaching. God rest him. And the rest of us. So, as I could multiply the Cave-isms, especially on morals, which is what he taught, among other things. But I want to say, so virtue then, it's a human virtue, which obviously is related to God in that He's made us human, that He's given us certain powers and faculties, and a sense of the good, which I've explained doesn't mean morally good necessarily. It means why you can kick a chair when it falls over, because it's a bad chair, but you can't blame an egg when you sit on it for being a bad egg. You're confusing natures, what they are. So you can't say of Fred or Mary whether they're good or bad unless you know what they're supposed to be. So that's the logic of it all. And the virtues are how we operate, express ourselves in a world, and it's always directed towards the good and is rational, which is why, so paradoxically, he can say you can't really misuse a virtue. You just haven't got a virtue. You've got some imitation of it. Because if it's rational and it bears on the good and it's free, well, then it can't be bad. So a few words on virtue ethics. David Goodale really is qualified for all this, and he's our moral theologian at Oxford. But Herbert used to claim he had no thoughts. I once asked Herbert, Herbert, what do you think about this? He says, sorry, he spoke like that. Bob, I have no thoughts. You mean what does St. Thomas think? Well, frankly, you're not even getting you're getting Herbert, frankly, rather than me. In many ways, I'm building on him, and so I've got David now, new voice. So virtue ethics has become very fashionable, very topical, first in philosophy, gradually in theology. Now, why is virtue ethics, the kind of thing we're doing this weekend, the best way of doing moral theology? Moral theology is like literary criticism. it enables you to understand better a work of literature. So moral theology is to help you understand your life better. It's not an alternative to living moral theology. It's how you live, whether it's deep or shallow or whatever. Now, the two alternatives to virtue ethics, which are still very dominant among non-Christians, but also, alas, among Christians. The first is called deontology, which basically means following the law, doing your duty, meeting your obligations. That's what morals is about. And, of course, it went through the confessional, because for most Catholics, the nearest you get to moral theology is when you go to confession. Because how else would you get near to moral theology? And if you're not a Dominican, obviously, and you come to weekends among ourselves. But for most Catholics, it's through a confessional, which of course is tied to sin, and is tied to what philosophers call type acts. Yeah, I killed one person, I stole 3 chickens, I kicked the cat. I mean, 1, 2, 3, type acts. Now that's like me showing you, you asked me, Bob, tell me about your life. And I brought out an album of photographs, and I showed you the photographs of my life. Now that's what like going to confession is. I show you a set of pictures of what I've done. But of course I can't show you what's between the photos. Why was he smiling? Why was she crying? Why did he hit him on the head? Well, the type act doesn't tell you that. That's what, unlike virtue ethics, it gives you the character. So you know it's more like a video than a photograph album, virtue ethics. And that's important, because we don't live just with isolated acts. It's important as human beings to know why we did things and why people did things to us and what we might do. So that's one very popular moral theology course, would be deontology, 10 Commandments, commandments of the Church, natural law, and so on. All obligations, all duty. The other, and that impresses Christians still as the main moral form, because we haven't read enough Aquinas on virtue ethics. The second view, which was first characterized by Elizabeth Anscombe, whose daughter is on the way as we speak, one of her daughters, as consequentialism, or utilitarianism, tied to Hume or Bentham or whatever. Now that's very, very popular. There's no right or wrong, there are no moral absolutes. Of anything you propose to do, you work out the consequences, and you base your doing it or not doing it on the consequences, whatever they are, or on utilitarianism. This gives us the best result. Now, of course, all that depends on various things. But an example which comes up, a terrorist tells you he's put a bomb on a plane at Heathrow Airport, but won't tell you which plane. Now, for many people, torturing that terrorist will be acceptable. They'll tell there being 300 innocent men, women, children being blown up, because they weigh up. And also 300 innocent lives are better than one terrorist life. And so on. And you multiply this in most things that you do. And that's very, very popular. Consequentialism or utilitarianism, as opposed to meeting duty and obligations. Again, I could go on about all these things, but I want to leave space to hear what you think. The second is, because each of us is a unique item, to use a neutral word, in the universe, and worth more than the universe itself in a way, and immortal. Anyone you've ever seen in the street, they're all immortal. They're not going to go away. They're not going to be annihilated. So it's a staggering thing to be human. So the moral life of such a being, which is a bridge, remember, between, for Thomas, if you ask Thomas, how should I get to know myself? Well, Thomas wouldn't say, as it were, we'll look in a mirror. He'd say, think of things, the star, the moon, the river, all non-living, but they're things, they exist. Think of plants, they're living, but are of a low level of activity and choice. Think of animals, which are a step up. Think of angels, which are spiritual. Now then you'll understand yourself. when you understand why you're similar to the moon and the rocks and the stars, why you're similar to a rose or any plant, why you're similar and different, why you're similar and different from your pet, and then why you're similar and different to an angel. And again, for Thomas, we each have a guardian angel given to us. Certainly at baptism, possibly at birth, but certainly at baptism. So that's how you understand yourself on this scale of being, to use a word he wouldn't use, but I'll give you the idea. And that's what all this is just a snippet of, this range then of our humanity, even before it's graced. The third element, the advantage of virtue ethics, is that it brings out character, as I've said. The alternatives being, well, I can't say at the moment, I'll have to see what the consequences are, or well, what are the benefits, what are the burdens, and obviously choose the one that's got most beneficial to you, and the one that's least burdensome. These are very, very popular contemporary views of all this. But what they cut out is the narrative. They're handing you a photograph album as opposed to a video of your life. Well, then you see why you did things or didn't do things, and who did what to you and you to them on the video. The last, one of the great moral theologians, Dominican, of course, and one of his chapters on morals is Aquinas' moral theology Christian? Question mark. Now, this is the Dominican writing about a saint, and you think, well, I think by now you wouldn't say, well, surely he was. Well, but you begin to see the problems. Where's Jesus Christ in all this? Where's the Trinity? On this sheet, as you see, it says, matters connected with virtues. The gifts of the Holy Spirit, the Beatitudes, the fruits, but they're connected. They're not part of the treatise as such on virtues. Now, so Pincus, one of the great masters of modern theology, in a way tries to salvage Aquinas as a Christian. It's not surprising. But also brings out the strengths, and that's what I'd like to do, of being so emphatically human, just human. And that's the link we have with non-Christians. Because I've been at endless discussions about morals, and usually the Christian at some point will say, well, because God says so. The other says, well, I don't believe in God. Or worse, well, the church says so. And I say, well, so what? I'm a Buddhist. But I still hear, believe it or not, Catholics going forward in discussion on God says or the church says. Now, of course, that has its place, but it's not all the place. But I've seen this I said so many times. Now, the strength of what I've said, that Aquinas has said, is that it postpones that, perhaps at a later stage, and we can collaborate with non-Christians, because these are human moral virtues, which all decent human beings should agree to. And that's the basis of the discussion. He then, Pincus, tries to salvage Thomas as a Christian, which might surprise you, but I think there have been a number of surprises already, I hope, tonight. He doesn't distinguish faith from reason the way we do. Because we read things through Reformation eyes, again, we think faith and reason, they're obviously opposites. Well, he wouldn't have seen that. He had far too noble a view of reason, and he didn't believe there were two levels of truth. There's, as it were, truth and Christian truth. Truth never contradicts itself. So there's only one truth. And the difference is that faith strengthens reason, because our minds are fallen, not just our senses. Well, we forget that sometimes. We've got fallen minds. That's what Miss Anscombe attributed many mistakes of philosophers to. Their fallen minds. Well, they weren't used to being taught by that. Young lecturer, or she wasn't even a lecturer at Oxford. So our minds are fallen, not just our senses. So faith strengthens, but it doesn't replace reason, but it also reveals things which reason can never arrive at, like the incarnation, that our God is Father, Son and Holy Spirit. Well, reason could never have told us that, but it doesn't contradict anything. One example, Martin said, still teach canon law, but I used to teach it in Rome. And my favourite course was canonizations, how you make saints. Yeah, you paid your money. And that's not how you make saints. So you interrupted me. Well, at least nobody gave me any money. But take miracles, which are needed. You need 2 miracles, roughly, to be canonized. And you have to be dead for 5 years, so none of you qualify yet. Now, miracle, right. So, somebody goes to a doctor, a series of doctors, and nothing happens. They say there's nothing we can do. She goes to Lourdes or prays or whatever. There's a miracle. Now, you think, clash of reason and faith. No. What goes wrong is when science stops being scientific and pretends to be theology. So, in honesty, all the atheist doctor can say is, we have no explanation for this, full stop. But Christian says, you're right, because on your scientific criteria, there is no explanation. It's God's direct action. That's what we call a miracle. So there's no clash between faith and reason. It's just when scientists stop being scientists and pretend they're theologians. And qua theologians, it's just like, you wouldn't ask a scientist, qua scientist, am I in love? Unless you're in love with the scientist, but Shakun some goat or whatever. Forgive my French. It's a Parisian accent that confuses you. Yeah. So first of all, then, the first defense of Thomas as a Christian is that faith and reason for him wouldn't have been that different and shouldn't be for us. But in our climate, they are. It's the usual objections to faith and Christianity. It's not scientific. The second, which Pincus gives, is between theology and philosophy. Well, I hope all I've said tonight, which has been, despite the people on the bus in front of Brian Davis, has quite a lot of philosophy. That's because of Aristotle, who is Thomas's main guide. But theology and philosophy wouldn't have been. There was no faculty of philosophy. He wouldn't have understood what you said. And for him, philosophers were pagans. I mean, that's his usual word. So, again, we mustn't use our categories for him. The things hadn't fallen apart quite the way they have since. So when he wrote, as it were, he would have been a bit puzzled if they said, well, this is all philosophy. Where's Jesus in this? Well, where's the Holy Spirit? Well, he'll tell you. 1, 2, and 3, matters connected with virtues, which we'll hear tomorrow more of. And then, finally, gospel and humanism. Again, humanism, like most of these words in morals, has gone downhill. In another sense, humanism was a positive evaluation of a human, even in relation to God. As I said, the Annunciation is a classic text for pseudo-spirituality. I mean, Our Lady didn't say yes instantly. She didn't obey instantly. She didn't obey unquestioningly. She asked 3 questions, and only when she got 2 answers did she give a third. So this is bogus. My last recommendation is Gerald Van, God rest him, OP. He wrote a wonderful book called Moral Dilemmas. Well, it's a collection of his essays. He died just before it came out, but it's all by him. And he has 2 chapters in there which I recommend to you. One is called Pseudo-Virtue, the other is called Pseudo-Vice. And both are very liberating. Of course, he wrote in the 50s and beginning of the 60s, where the deontological model, morals to do with keeping the law, doing your duty, obeying, was dominant. And it went through the confessional, which therefore meant it went through sin, all of which is necessary, but not the entirety. Well, pseudo-virtue, he tries to rescue proper virtue from, as it were, can I put it, conventional goodness, non-shocking goodness. And also, you have to be sure of people's intentions and motives. And one example he gives, I think it's in that book, but I'll give it to you anyway. Now, suppose he was a married man, and he says, I've never been with another woman, ever. I've been absolutely faithful, I'm chaste, just my wife. Oh, yeah. Then you say, well, can you talk a bit more? He says, well, yeah, I'm afraid of catching a disease. Well, you haven't got a chaste man, you've got a frightened man. So he hasn't got the virtue of chastity, he's got fear of disease. Or another one which he gives is, you're afraid of being caught. I think it's somewhere in Plato, I think it's Gyges. Is it? Ah, mais oui, merci. Oh, that's your actual French. Yeah, Gaiji's ring. Basically, the theory is, if you had a ring that made you invisible, would you keep being good? Or would you do all the wrong things you really want to, but are scared of being caught? See, that would be a test. You see. But if your character is virtuous, you wouldn't, even with Gaiji's ring making you invisible. So he examines virtue, and also we know a lot more about psychology now than obviously Aquinas did, and so we can't be quite sure, why we're doing things. Hence, the very contemporary expressions. Yeah, but what is she really after? What's he really saying? That comes spontaneous to us, you see. And again, there's a whole bunch of modern philosophers called masters of suspicion. It's always things are never what they seem. They're always, what does he mean? What's she after? Now, there's some truth in all that, obviously, but more than Thomas would have known. So pseudo-virtue, you have to be careful, because it might be in fact something else, which looks like virtue, but doesn't come out of a rational, willed choice. The other pseudo-vice, which is more liberating, well, unless it's a human act, it's full knowledge and consent, then it's not a sin. What you do might be wrong, but that's the wrong moral philosophy and theology, to look at what you do. You have to look at who you are. And then a lot of people, remember this, he's writing in the 50s and early 60s, a lot of people tormented themselves with what is in fact was pseudo-vice. They weren't in control of what they were doing, yet they blamed themselves. Well, it's very hard to get people out of that. I will stop. Well, I'll stop. But no shout, so carry on. What do you mean? We can get him off. I've been booked till past. So my contract says I was a lawyer, And anyway, you can always tell the Dominican, it's just you can't tell him much, as you know. Do you mind suggesting?
Thank you, Bob, very much for that wonderful talk. The cheque will be on its way. Let's just take 5 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes, just talk amongst yourselves, just comments you've got on what you've just heard. Obviously, some people have just arrived.